Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody, and good afternoon and good evening, depending on where you're logging in from. My name is Eddie Mandry, and I'm Director for Africa and the Middle East at Yale University, spearheading Yale's Africa Initiative. And very delighted to welcome you to this first session fireside conversation on leading for change with Simidele Adeagbo. It's really great to have many of you logging in from all over the world. We have people from over 40 countries registered for this event, across Africa, Europe, Asia, even Indonesia is represented. So we have quite a great audience. We also have in attendance some amazing Yale Young African Scholars programs. I want to give a shout out to all the YAS alumni who are tuning in from all over the continent and the world. But now I'd like to introduce our distinguished speaker. So with us today, we have Simidele Adeagbo. She is a trailblazing Olympian, passionate advocate, and inspirational speaker focused on building a better world through sport. Simidele made Olympic history in 2018 Winter Games by becoming the first Nigerian Winter Olympian and the first African Black woman to compete in the skeleton at the Olympics. And Simi, you're going to have to explain what the skeleton is. She's also a seasoned storyteller. The voice of female athletes. She aims to use sport as a tool to create social empowerment, impact policy, increase economic prosperity, and overall health and wellness. She's presented on numerous stages internationally, conferences at Nike Inc., TEDx, Global, Google, Facebook, Forbes Women's Summit, NBA Innovation Summit, and many others. She's also been featured in publications such as USA Today, Essence, Forbes, Self, and Sports Illustrated as well. She's recognized as one of the most influential young Africans in 2018 and honored by OK Africa on the 100 Women's list, Bustle's list, Black Women History Makers, and Guardian's Women 100 Most Inspiring Leading Ladies in Africa. Simi, we're delighted to have you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
And I will also mention she's a Yale World Fellow from class of 2019, so we're delighted to be reconnected with you. So first, kind of to kick off our discussion, so there'll be about 25 minutes of conversation between us, then we'll have Q&A from the audience. I'd like to acknowledge kind of the movement in Nigeria at the moment, the End SARS movement. You've represented Nigeria on the global stage. There's a concerted movement right now, spearheaded by young people, but cutting across all generations right. to advocate against police brutality in Nigeria. I just wanted to give you the opportunity kind of to speak to this movement that's now becoming a global movement across the world.
Yes, it really is. And I'm glad we have a moment just to acknowledge that. My thoughts, my prayers are with everybody in Nigeria right now on the ground. I hope everybody is safe and you're doing okay. This is a rough moment for Nigeria. Police brutality is a horrible thing, as we know. But what I feel is the hope around this moment as well, even though it is tough with everything that's happening and things that are not okay are happening. But I feel that this is a real inflection point for the country. To me, this energy around this youth movement specifically, and this kind of recognition that this is not just only about police brutality, that's certainly where it started. But I feel that this is really an opportunity for a complete social revolution, and that perhaps this is a real push and a turning point where we're going to see changes that so many Nigerians want and deserve in terms of education, health, infrastructure, corruption to go away. Really hope that this is a starting point to some serious changes in the country. So yeah, I'm optimistic about that.
No, so thank you. And thank you for kind of highlighting the fact that, police brutality is one of many issues that people are stepping up to fight against in Nigeria, and to draw attention to essentially some of the deficits in what has made it a very difficult time for many people living in states of poverty, and many people feeling like they don't have sufficient opportunity. And so, like you said, it's an inspiring moment. And I think there's interest both within Nigeria and outside Nigeria to see change happen.
Yes.
So to begin our conversation, it would be great to start off just with kind of your definition of leadership. You know, what does leadership mean to Simi?
Yeah, well, I think leadership to me is being able to blaze a trail. You noted that in my introduction, I'm trailblazing, right? What does that actually mean? I think there's different ways to be a trailblazer. I think it's really recognizing opportunity and taking action on it, seeing spaces where maybe people haven't traveled before and having the courage to enter those spaces and really create your own path and leave your mark in a new way. Doesn't always mean having to start from scratch, but perhaps building on something. So, for example, I didn't invent the sport of skeleton, and we'll get to what it actually is in a second. But I didn't invent that sport, but I put my own spin on it by kind of recognizing the opportunity that no African woman had competed in this sport at the Olympic Games. And so for me, leadership in that moment was really taking action on that and just going through that process and going after it, and making sure that African women could be represented in a sport that seems very unlikely. And so that to me is leadership, just being willing to go perhaps where other people may not be willing to go, and having the courage to try new things.
Excellent. No, thank you for noting, especially the fact that you didn't have to reinvent the wheel in certain respects, but taking risks, taking a chance, and having the courage kind of to do something different, blaze a trail. And so tell us a little bit about how you got into competitive sport of skeleton in particular, but also kind of the distinction between, luge, skeleton, bobsledding. I, for one, learned about the sport of bobsledding through the film Cool Runnings. Some of our participants might be too young to know about this, but it was about the Jamaican bobsledding team. So I'm curious about how you wound up as an African participating in what is a sport that features in the Winter Olympics. We don't have too many winters on our continent.
Yeah, so like you, I mean, Cool Runnings was my reference point, right? That movie now is about 32 years old.
Wow.
That was for 1988 Olympic Games in Calgary. And so growing up, I had seen that movie, but that was really all I knew about the sport of bobsled. So they are different. So the three that you mentioned, bobsled, skeleton, and luge. So we'll start with bobsled, because I think that's the one people actually know the most, because they may have seen that movie Cool Runnings. So in bobsled, just kind of imagine driving a little car, like imagine being in a NASCAR, for example. You are an actual physical car. It's about 300 pounds. And bobsled is a team sport for the most part. And, although they have now introduced a new sport, which is a single person bobsled sport, which I'm also training for the 2022 Olympics. But normally it's a 2 or 4 man sport. So you are with a teammate, you are racing down the track in this big heavy car, and you're covered in something, and you're just trying to get down this ice track, which is about a mile long. You're going at speeds of maybe 140 kilometers an hour, up to going super fast. That's faster than most cars are traveling down the freeway.
Yeah.
And you are a pilot trying to navigate your way down this track. So that's bobsled. Skeleton, you are not covered in any kind of vehicle. You are essentially lying down on your tummy, going head first on what looks to be a tea tray on ice skates. So just imagine a tea tray on ice skates and somebody laying down on that and going head first down the same track that the bobsled goes on.
That sounds terrifying.
It can be very terrifying. And you're going at the same speeds, right? And now all you have is your body to kind of use to navigate, because there's nothing covering you. You're not driving any apparatus. You're laying there on a tea tray going head first. Okay, now the third sport that you mentioned is called luge. So luge, you're actually going feet first.
Mm.
And there's always a big kind of tension in the community, which one is crazier. I think luge is crazier because I rather go head first and see my way down the track than go
Ah,
feet first and not
I
really have
see.
a great vantage point. So similar to skeleton, but you're on your back in luge and you're going feet first down the track. So that's the difference between the three of them. Now, how did I get involved in skeleton?
Yes.
Well, yeah, because it's not something that you would normally stumble upon, especially coming from Nigeria. So I lived in Nigeria the first 6 years of my life, and then my family relocated to the US. And I also spent some time in Canada. But even in that relocation to the US, I didn't know too much about the sport.
Yeah.
Um, it started about 100 days before the Olympics, believe it or not. Before the 2018 Olympic Games, I discovered that no African or Black woman had ever competed in Olympic skeleton. I first actually was introduced to the sport through bobsled
Mhm.
because my teammates, my bobsled teammates, were already on the journey before me, trying to become the first team from an African country to make it to the Olympics. And so when I started hearing about them doing this in bobsled, I was super interested, not only about the possibility of becoming an Olympian, but also, and bigger perhaps, the possibility of making history for the continent of Africa at the Winter Olympics. And so I tried out for the bobsled team. It turns out that they already had the team in place. And he said, "Well, what about skeleton? Have you ever thought about that?" I said, "What is skeleton?" Well, I've never heard of this, really. I don't know much about it. Saw some video, was initially turned off and scared and terrified. But ultimately, I realized that for me, it came down to this bigger mission, this bigger opportunity of, hey, I can make history. I can, through this, I can somehow help contribute to shaping the narrative of the continent in a positive way and creating some representation. And so at that point, it didn't matter if I'm going down the track in a bobsled or a skeleton sled. And 100 days before the Olympics, I took up this sport, and here I am 2 years later.
That is amazing, especially the 100 days before the Olympics. I mean, that just speaks to kind of your tenacity and grit. Um, so, how has your life changed since making it to the Pyeongchang Olympics? You know, what did that do? You know, in terms of catapulting you into the international stage, but also having the pressure of representing a whole nation. What impact did that have on you?
Well, it makes a difference when you're on an Olympic stage. That is a world stage. You know, there's millions of eyes on you, and it was something that I wasn't really prepared for necessarily. I had dreamt of going to the Olympics my whole life, but never really prepared for that moment where I would be thrust into the spotlight and now have what I think is a bigger obligation and a responsibility of what to do with that platform. And so I would say the biggest difference before the Olympics and now is really looking at that responsibility, taking it seriously, and thinking about the ways that I want to make impact through this platform. For me, I have focused primarily on how, through my kind of journey, I can take that and help the future generation that's coming up. Leadership is something that to me is critical. We're seeing that now with what we spoke about earlier on with the SARS, and the youth are driving that.
Yeah.
And I'm particularly passionate about young women as leaders and how we can close that leadership gap, help them become the leaders that I know they already are, and really bring that out of them at an early age. So since coming back from the Olympics, I've made a focused effort to work with girls across the continent, various countries, Morocco, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, and kind of go and share lessons of life,
Mhm.
lessons of leadership. Also, we do that through sport because sport is a language that those skills. You learn a lot by being an athlete, communication skills, teamwork. So we just build them up, help them understand the greatness that lies within them. And then I think that to me is an important part of this platform, is to give back and to share some knowledge. So that is the biggest change. Also for me too, because my Olympic journey was so unconventional and almost in a way radical, it's taught me a lot about kind of ways to approach life. I think I in those 100 days just embraced the possibility that okay, this could go horribly wrong. But for whatever reason, in that space, I wasn't as concerned about the outcome, and I was just focused on, just go for it and see what's possible. And I think that really helped me. That kind of mindset of just being willing to fail, being willing to be so naive to say, it doesn't, I don't know what's going to happen, but I want to try it anyways. And I have tried now to carry that kind of mindset and that spirit with me forward, and in terms of an ethos of how to live life.
Oh, that's beautifully stated, and thank you, obviously, for all the work in addition to just being a leading athlete, but also a role model to many young athletes, aspiring athletes who want to achieve great success in sport. And so the next question is centered around this issue of setbacks. Sometimes when you achieve success, people look at you at that station of success without necessarily having a sense of the adversity that you might have gone through to achieve that success. How have you kind of dealt with setbacks, the uphill battles, the injuries, and so on that athletes sometimes face, and the risks that you take? How have you dealt with the adversity? Have you ever thought about throwing in the towel? And how, where do you get your motivation to persevere and push on?
Yes, I think that's a great question, because those challenges are as much part of the journey as the successes. So I think I've learned over time to embrace those as part of the process as well. But two specific examples kind of come to mind. The first is that for me, my Olympic dream didn't start with skeleton. I was an athlete pretty much my whole life. I played a number of different sports, but track and field was the sport that I was kind of the most dominant in and had the most success in. So, from maybe around the time I was a teenager, I always dreamt that I would be a summer Olympian. This was my original Olympic dream, and I worked every day to try to reach that goal.
Mm.
Actually tried out for two Olympic games for the Summer Olympics. I did the triple jump, by the way. If there's any
Wow.
track athletes out there, triple jumpers, shout out.
All right.
That was my event, and so back in 2008, that was the time. That was the Olympics that I thought I was going to be at, and I made every effort to make that goal. I even moved to a special Olympic training center to train there for a few years with a
Wow.
coach, and but at the Olympic trials, which is just you get one day, and if you're in the top three, you go to the Olympics. If you're not, you're sitting at home.
Wow.
And it's just boils down to everything comes down to those 2 hours of
A
competition.
tryout. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. And so I fell short by a few inches, and that was extremely disappointing. I don't even know if there's a word strong enough, but it was very hard to come to terms with, because I spent so many years working towards that one goal.
Mm.
And so when I didn't make that, it took some time to really work through that, to process it. In fact, I traveled to Beijing, China, where the games were that
Wow.
summer, because one of my good friends and training partners actually did make the team.
Okay.
So I went there to support her. She won a gold medal, and
Wow.
it was yeah, it was a moment where I was happy for her, but still so devastated with my own situation. But I had to move past that. And I think for me, I ended up putting my kind of Olympic dream at that point, just saying, I've pursued it, I've given it my all. What gave me solace in that moment was I, I knew I had done everything I could.
Yeah.
When I reflected, I didn't feel that there was anything more that I could have done. So I was at peace with knowing that I could move on to something else. And so I focused on my career for the next 10 years or so. I was working in marketing at the time. And through that, got a job opportunity in Johannesburg and was just living my life. But when I heard about the Nigerian women's bobsled team, that's when everything changed. And I realized that that Olympic dream, in fact, never died within
Right.
me. It was still there. I just needed it revived in a different way. So when it came around this time through the sport of bobsled, which eventually led to skeleton, it just was rebirthed. So what I learned through that adversity is that sometimes you just have to be willing to reimagine your dream, right? The original dream was to be a summer Olympian, and I thought that I would be there with the sun and the sand, but there was a different plan, and it ended up being snow and ice,
Yeah. Yeah.
But the goal was still the same, to be an Olympian. And so I think that that's something that all leaders go through, right? You have a vision, you have a goal, but sometimes whether you're forced to or you need to adapt to it, you have to reimagine it. The original way you thought you were going to get there is not the way that you end up getting there. So yeah, that was a moment of great adversity. And then quickly, just another story was um, in my early days of skeleton, I was still learning the sport. So my first week, and I went to one of the toughest tracks out there where you're going at very high speed. So if you're going 140 at this track, you're going 150.
Wow.
And I didn't know what I was doing yet. And I got myself in a situation where I actually ended up turned around. I spun out of control and I was going feet first down the track, which, as I explained, is actually luge, not skeleton. And it was a moment that was really scary. And I had to really evaluate in that moment where I was praying and just praying that I would survive. Do I really want to do this sport after that? Because you take a lot of really hard hits at the beginning. That's the nature
Right.
of the sport. As you're learning, you have to overcome some of those challenges. But those are the things that force you to learn, because you learn what not to do. That was one of those moments where I learned, okay, I know that this is what gets you turned around the wrong way. So now I know what not to do. But there's lots of moments like that. And what helps me through those moments, especially in that journey to the Olympics, was keeping my bigger mission in the forefront. So even on the days where I felt frustrated or scared or felt like giving up, that bigger kind of North Star of this is a way for me to help to shape the narrative of Africa in a positive way. Like that was the bigger force. That was the purpose that was powering the journey. That
Yeah.
helped me keep going. So
That's really wonderful. I mean, you do speak well about kind of having a North Star, this vision that you had, but also it's interesting to hear you speak about kind of the winding roads. You might think there's a linear path, but the road to your kind of aspiration could take you in different directions. And what I love about what you've said is, how important it is to look for the lessons and take insight from what you might learn through your mistakes. And someone once said that success is being able to move from one failure to the next by learning through those failures and using them to drive you forward. So thank you for sharing that. Often there are people in our lives who either we look up to, who lift us up when we're down, or even unbeknownst to them, are a source of strength to us. Who would you identify as kind of, the individual or individuals who've kind of been in your corner and, helped get you to where you are today?
yeah, so I think I don't have to look too far. I have a very strong Nigerian mother who keeps me going every day, and who's just very strong. And I think I grew up as a child of immigrants, watching my parents relocate to the U.S. and really have to work hard for everything that they achieved.
Right.
And so I think just watching that really helped me develop a strong work ethic and shaped kind of my views of the world and how I approach things. And so I think they've always been kind of in my corner. So I would say my parents, and then if I have to kind of say like on a celebrity level, I've looked up to Serena Williams for a long time. In fact, I was once her body double. Thank you. And, you know, she's just amazing. She's
She
one of
really is.
athletes of all time. And so through my Olympic journey, I made sure that I paid homage to her legacy in some way because I felt that I was an extension of that. Because when you think about what her and Venus did when they were breaking barriers in the sport of tennis as teenagers bursting onto the scene, that created an image that tennis was achievable. And now we're seeing the ripple effect of that years later. You think about all the women of color that are now doing really well on the professional tennis circuit.
Right.
I've always kind of looked up to her. We're in the same age range, so I consider myself one of the Williams sisters, honorary Williams sisters.
Excellent.
But they're very inspiring.
No, they really are. They really are. And and then, you know, Serena is absolutely amazing in terms of what she's been able to achieve in the world of tennis. And so, you know, another question is connected to what you just mentioned, which is being the daughter of immigrants. You know, we know the stereotypes of the tough immigrant African parents who have, and even non-immigrants, even on the continent, a lot of African parents have a very specific view about, you know, what you should study in college and, you know, become an engineer, become a lawyer, become a scientist. And so I'm very curious about, and one of our participants sent a question connected to this, which is, how did you deal with, you know, the expectations that the African kind of community, but family in particular, might have on what professional success is like? You know, becoming a professional athlete often doesn't feature on the list of careers that African families might encourage their children to pursue.
That is a great question because that person must know it very well, and that is often the case. But I think my parents always made sure that myself and my sisters and brother, we knew that academics came first. Sport was something that we did, I think, for us to be well-rounded, but my parents didn't play any games when it came to making books were first. In fact, in high school, there was a point where, you know, I was one of the prominent high school athletes in the state of Kentucky where I grew up, getting ready to, you know, go to a state championship. And I came back with some bad grades on my report card and they shut that down really quickly. And my coach had to call and there were some negotiations and, you know, we made it work. But I think they laid that groundwork from very early, and that became kind of how I approached life as well. So for me, I have had the privilege of always being able to pursue things in parallel. So sport is a part of me, will always be a part of me, but I never lost sight of my career as well. Same way as I was a student athlete, when I now graduated university, I continued to pursue you know, my career outside of sport, and the two worked hand in hand. I worked at Nike, which is, you know, obviously a top sports company. The reason that I bring that up too is because when you can find the career that speaks to your passion, then it's just your sweet spot. I think that, you know, being a professional athlete is always not seen as a plan A, but if you can find that space where you can connect professionally to the things that you're passionate about. Parents may not always understand that, but I think people can't really argue when you really feel that you are in that space where you're in a position of strength and really excelling at what you do. So I would just say, you know, I understand the challenges that definitely can come with that, but this is part of leadership as well. Is being comfortable with the uncomfortable and knowing that not everyone's going to get your vision. When I started Skeleton, there were a lot of people who didn't understand why I was doing it. They didn't even understand what it was, let alone why I was doing it. And it didn't make sense to a lot of people. But I think as a leader, you have to be willing to be comfortable. No, not everybody going to understand your vision, and be willing to move forward with it anyways. We'd love as much support as possible, but sometimes that's not always the case.
No, and thank you for acknowledging that, sometimes it's not always, the support is not always there, but at the same time, there is great value in having that foundation of education, that either for whatever reason, due to injury or whatever other factors might come into play, you have something to fall back on.
Definitely.
I'm sure that gets the family members feeling a little bit more comfortable. I'm going to turn into the Q&A from the audience. So participants, if you have a question, please submit it through the Q&A box. We have one from Linos Chipakwe. He's a student in Turkey. And his question was around whether you think leadership is something someone develops over time through experience and life experience, or is it something that's inborn and innate? And that's also connected to another question that I want to tie with that is, feeling sometimes like you're an imposter, and they mentioned imposter syndrome. So how have you ever dealt with imposter syndrome? What do you think about it? And so kind of the question around leadership, whether it's inborn, and then there's the question around imposter syndrome.
Yeah, I don't think that there's a leadership gene out there. I think everybody has the potential to be a leader. So I think it's a matter of nurture, not nature. So, and the most difficult part often I feel is discovering who you are as a leader. Because what happens sometimes is I think we look at other examples, this person's leadership style and that person's leadership style. And I think it's good to be inspired by others and kind of start getting some ideas and learning from the ways that others do it. But their leadership style will look completely different to mine. And sometimes I think that's where we get that confused with, oh, maybe so-and-so is not a leader. His style of leadership might just look very different than somebody else. And I saw this happen a lot in the corporate, where sometimes the loudest voices that would drown out everybody else's were seen as the leaders. But that wasn't always the case. So I would just say leadership is something that you can nurture, but the most important part of nurturing that is nurturing what that looks like for you and being comfortable enough to lead in your own authentic way, whatever that looks like. So
thank you for that answer. And there are many young people who just due to circumstance ended up assuming leadership roles, just like in Nigeria at the moment, given the current situation they're facing. I think back to kind of the Soweto uprising of young people who were instrumental in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. And there's many instances of civil rights leaders in the US leveraging youth movements in the United States. So there's always roles that people can play, even when they don't necessarily identify themselves as leaders.
Yes, I just tag.
Yeah, go ahead.
One thing that I think I'm seeing in today's generation, not to be the old auntie here, but I just feel like leadership today, people almost want it as a hashtag all the time, or it always has to be forward facing, on blast on social media. There's sometimes actions that are happening that you can do and it's still leadership. I think leadership is really about using the privilege of wherever you are, whatever platform that looks like, and doing whatever you can in that space and finding ways in which you can transform or leave your footprint there. It doesn't always have to be, just out there, and nothing wrong. I think it's great to give voice to causes and things that we should be paying attention to, and social media has its role. But I think what I'm seeing these days is that sometimes I think people just use that as like the only measure of leadership. If you're out there, doing something on social media and being overly vocal about it. Leadership can be quiet. It can be actions that you take that maybe nobody even knows about. So just
I
wanted to
like
add.
that. I like that distinction that, it's not just the public facing, loud, microphone holding, megaphone holding role that exemplifies leadership, but they could be quiet, more silent, more behind the scenes leadership, and many ways to take action on issues that you're passionate about. Thank you for drawing attention to that. We have a question from a participant who speaks on the issue of fear. Were you at any time afraid of letting Nigeria down on the global stage, kind of scared of not kind of succeeding to achieve your goals? And it's connected to another question on insecurities. Many of us have insecurities, all of us do. And how do you kind of stop or prevent against those overwhelming your ability to push forward?
Okay, thank you for those questions. And we actually forgot to go back to the imposter syndrome question.
That's right.
And I want to tie that back into the insecurities, because I think that's essentially what manifests to be imposter syndrome at the end. And I want to share with you my experience at the Olympics. And so imagine now I get to the Olympics only having 100 days of experience in this sport. And now I'm here, and the world's best are here with me. And suddenly I'm starting to feel this imposter syndrome. These insecurities are coming on strong. Now I'm finally at this pinnacle sport moment. And I'm realizing that, wait a minute, I have way less experience than everybody else here. I've been doing the sport just 3 months, and many of these women have been doing the sport maybe from the time they were teenagers, years and years of experience. And I started having this flood of doubt that just came over me. But you're at the Olympic Games. This is not the time for that, right? This is when it matters most, and you have to find a way to find that confidence and really just believe that you belong in that moment. And so for me, what ended up helping me was on the strengths that I had. So I might have not had as much experience as my competitors, and only having done the sport a few months. But what I remembered was that I'm actually one of the fastest athletes here. And, I have years of a track and field background. And in the sport of skeleton, there is the start of the race, you run for about 30 meters or so, and you try to build as much speed for the rest of the race. And if you have a great start, that can really give you an advantage for the rest of the race. And so when I started honing in on that part, the first 5 seconds of the race, and really knowing and building my confidence in that, and knowing that that was my superpower, and allowing that to become my competitive advantage, that freed me of the imposter syndrome. Because suddenly now my focus is not on what I can't do, but it's on what I can do and what I can do well. And so for the first 5 seconds at the Olympic Games, I was actually in gold medal position. Wow. The unfortunate reality is they don't hand out medals for 5 seconds of the race. But
Right.
But the point was, I was able to really pivot my mindset in a way that allowed me to perform at my best when it mattered most. And so I think this applies to anybody, whether you're stepping onto a skeleton track or walking into a boardroom or a classroom that maybe you just feel like you don't belong, or feel like maybe you don't have the knowledge or experience that everybody else has. What is it that you have? Press into that strength and allow that to shine, and let it be your superpower. So that helped through that moment. The other thing that I did as well at the Olympics is that, tied to kind of the bigger mission of how can I help kind of celebrate Africa's narrative as I know it, I used the Olympic stage and the platform as the opportunity to just shine, let the world see the brilliance of what it is to be an African woman, and allow myself to be a canvas to tell that story from head to toe. So I really enjoyed the process of, what braids am I going to wear, and what is it going to tell the world about my and how we look and what we want to show up like.
Mm.
And through that process was able not to get there into a space where people didn't look like me and try to assimilate, but to get there and feel the power in my own authenticity and let that expression be what the world came to know. And so that's another thing that I think is just really just finding that power in your own authenticity and confidence that you're coming with enough.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know?
that's really well said. Finding your superpower, figuring out your comparative advantage, leaning into that, and also just being a proud ambassador for the country, the continent, and women of color,
Yeah.
and using that as motivation rather than something that inspires fear, but to build your confidence. That's
Yeah.
really great.
And I
Thank
didn't answer about the pressure because
you.
as you said that, I was remembering the pressure that does come with that
Yeah,
at
yeah,
some point. So yeah, the world is watching, right? Everybody is watching. I remember at the Olympics, after day one of competition, I started seeing on social media, there was a newspaper in Nigeria that had my picture on it and a big headline that said, Simidele disappoint.
oh dear.
And that was the headline. And I mean, I still had day two of competition, and they already were saying I disappointed. And so that stuff like that happens, especially in this world that we live in now. So there is pressure, especially to your point of sometimes we are the first to walk into the spaces that we are going into. We're the first, maybe from our families or whatever. And so you want to show up well. The ways that I go about that and handling that is, to me, preparation
Mhm.
helps that. If you walk in somewhere, whether I'm stepping on the starting line and I know that I've done everything that I can, I've done the workouts, I've done the visualization, I've eaten the right food, I'm ready. There should be no pressure. All it's now about is just executing on what I've been doing every day. This is just another of building on what I've been building on. We're human, right? We really have that anxiety, and I think even now, one of the things I'm focusing on going into Beijing is really training my mind to be as strong as it can be.
Mm.
That's where, as an athlete, it's between your two ears. Everybody is equally strong at the Olympic level. Everybody's capable. It's what's happening here that matters. So really working on how can I, in those moments where I'm feeling under pressure, shift my thoughts. And this I'm working with like a sports psychologist to help me just prepare. How do I, in those moments where I'm under pressure, know that I need to first recognize that and really focus on the thoughts that are going to help me move toward the goal, not the thoughts that are going to move me away from the goal. So
Mm.
just being clear in your mind. Okay, yes, I'm here. I'm feeling nervous. I'm feeling anxious, but that's not helping. Okay, what can I focus on that will help? Oh, the fact that I'm prepared, the fact that I have a race plan, the fact that, I've warmed up properly. So just being able to shift that focus mentally. This takes practice. I'm still practicing this. So that's how I handle it.
I'm really glad you brought that up in terms of just focusing on the positive, reorienting your thoughts, and kind of the psychology of sport, and the mental toughness that's necessary to be able to, step up and stand up and step ahead. And so I think you really raise an important point and give some good tips on how you can try to reorient and redirect some of the negative energies and thoughts that might creep in when there's anxiety. Someone raised a really interesting question. We have some time for a few more questions on, and this is from Vuyo Kakweni. He says, how do you know and how do you judge when it's time to step down from a leadership role?
Ooh, that is a really good question. And there's not one answer to that
Yeah.
question. So, uh, and I would just say for me, I'll give an example of, I mentioned that I tried out for the Olympics, the Summer Olympics, and I didn't make it. And when I came back from that experience in Beijing, watching my gold medal, I felt very torn in that moment because I felt that, I'm disappointed I didn't make my goal. But part of me still wanted to carry on. Part of me thought, okay, it's time to just, you know, move on from track and field. And I spent a good like 6 to 9 months just torn. And for me, that was an indication that it was time to move on, because my nature is usually when I want something, it usually doesn't, I don't stay in the gray. It's clear to me that it's time, it's time to do this and take action. But the fact that I was in the gray for so long, to me, was an indication that perhaps it was time to put that on pause. And what ended up happening was that it was a pause, even though it was a decade long pause,
Yeah.
it was a pause. So I think there will be times where maybe it's not necessarily walking away forever, but you step back and you focus on other things. And I think that 10 years, I was doing other things, developing myself in other ways. This was an opportunity to, professionally develop myself, personally develop myself. And then when it came back around and this opportunity to be an Olympic athlete came back around, I think I was just in a different space at that time, a space that allowed me to just approach it differently, and just be free to try something new. So I don't know if that definitively answered your question, but I hope that, if there's you take from that, it's just that sometimes it's okay to take a step back. It might just be a pause.
Yeah.
And if it's meant, for you to return to that thing, have the faith that it will come back to you, and maybe in a different way. Who knows?
Yeah, and then I've also seen that often it's important to recognize our own strengths and our own leadership, but it's also important to be able to recognize those capabilities in others, and being able to see leadership, both in emerging leaders or leaders in our midst, and knowing when there might be someone who has that comparative edge in a specific issue or area, and then being able to share the spotlight or offer the spotlight for them to take on an issue or an action. So I think there's enough room for many leaders on many issues, and I think it's imperative as well for people who do achieve leadership to sometimes think of those who are emerging in the pipeline and could have new and creative perspectives on specific issues. We have a question on, first of all, a lot of compliments are coming in the chat. So I'm having a hard time keeping track here, Simi. I think
Thank
people
you.
really appreciate your message, and I want to acknowledge that. There is a question on coming from difficult circumstances. There's young people and a young person, a couple of questioners who've asked about coming from moderate means, and having to sometimes settle for a traditional path, a career path, and so on, without necessarily having the option. What advice would you give a young person in a situation like that? And there's also a question about becoming a competitive athlete as an adult. What advice do you have for somebody who thinks they have some potential, but might consider themselves maybe not to be young enough, given the traditional paths people take to competitive sport?
Yeah. Okay, so the first question really around being in a circumstance that makes it extra challenging to get after the goals that you have. And those are definitely real things. We know that there's various situations that people grow up in that create some significant challenges. I think the thing that is the reality is that sometimes we can't wait for the circumstances around us to change, and we have to find the wherewithal, no matter how difficult, to try to break from those circumstances. I recently finished Michelle Obama's book, Becoming,
Hmm.
and I was just blown away by I mean, I knew her story, but not intimately, but just hearing about the circumstances in which she grew up in the South Side of Chicago. And from that was able to emerge into becoming the first lady of States.
Yeah.
And one of the things that she mentioned in the book is she's still very connected to the Chicago and going to visit schools there where, in one school that she describes, sitting with students who gun violence is just like a normal thing for them as they're walking home from school, and them asking her the question of what is the government going to do? How are they going to help us? And she turning and saying, I wish I could tell you they were. But the reality is, change takes a lot of time, progress takes a lot of time. And it might be years before, true change comes from like the top down or a government kind of policy that is going to change your circumstances. But you can change your circumstance. You have the power, even with the situations around you, to try to find the resources, try to find the opportunities, try to find the mentors, try to find those ways that you can be determined and try to break out of that system. So I know it's not easy. I'm not minimizing that in any way, shape, or form, but I hope that whatever circumstance that we all find ourselves in, we know that we can try to find a way to break out of that in whatever way that looks like for us.
Right. And so you raise a really important point. And I think there's also, there's a lot that young people can do in their kind of present state. They have voice, they have their agency, you have your power as young people. And I think there's also a connectivity now across young people across the globe.
Yeah.
It's now easier to connect with your peers, your counterparts, and being able to borrow lessons from other parts of the world that might contribute to the transformation in your own community. So the
Yeah.
technology is bringing us together. It's got its downsides, but it's also got its upsides. I love your point about learning from other people's lessons and reading autobiographies. I think it's been extremely valuable in my life, reading autobiographies and biographies of people who've gone before us or people who are still here, who are willing to share their lessons from their lives. Sometimes we think what we're going through is unique to us, but
Yeah.
it's actually not necessarily the case. Many people suffer adversity, suffer setbacks, and have to figure out ways to navigate out of that. And Becoming is a great example of a book that just speaks to her journey and the lessons she has to share. And many people write these kinds of books. You can find them online. There's different places where you could in your local library. But now so much content is online anyway, so you could find a lot of that stuff online. We have time for one more question, and so it's connected to maybe what inspires you. It's actually a two-part question. Someone wants to know, when was the last time you were in Nigeria? And then connected to that, what's your favorite artist or musician that you're listening to right now?
Okay, there was one question that I can't remember. I should have written it down
Yes.
that was part of that other question, and I didn't answer. So if we can pull that up, if you remember that, maybe we still have time for it. But
Um,
I'll
yeah,
go on
I'll
with
try and find it. Go
okay,
ahead.
all right. I'll go on with how often do I visit Nigeria? So pre-COVID, I tried to get to Nigeria around 2 to 3 times a year. I normally live in Johannesburg, South Africa, which is not too far away versus coming from the U.S. But now I'm actually in the U.S. due to COVID, and so I haven't been able to go this year at all. But I try to go 2 to 3 times a year. I'd like to go more, and especially with all of these movements that's happening. To
Yeah.
be honest, I'm feeling more disconnected from it than I'd like to. I'm calling my friends in Nigeria to get from them an understanding of what's happening. And so I want to feel more connected in terms of just being able to have more of a presence. And so I have to figure out what that looks like. But and I'm learning Yoruba, for those who might want to know. I took a Yoruba class at Yale, and slowly but surely, dia dia, I'm working on it.
Fantastic. That's so great to hear. But yes, I know for many in the diaspora, they feel disconnected sometimes from what's happening on a day-to-day basis on the continent. I consider myself among those people. But it's been also great to see the action against police brutality, but the actions in solidarity with the demands for young people in Nigeria spread around the globe. In London, in New York, there was a big protest yesterday. In New Haven, the students at Yale were in downtown New Haven over the last weekend, showing their solidarity with the young people in Nigeria. So the movements are global, the issues are interconnected, and we have people demonstrating their leadership every single day in ways that might not make it to the global stage or the headlines, to make a difference in their communities. So Simi, what might you have as a closing message? If you had to give advice to your younger self, what would it be? And what's your last message to the group?
Okay, last message to the group. Well, I think if we would have been having this conversation 4 years ago, in 2016, I would have never imagined that I would be sitting here as an Olympian in a sport called skeleton, much less that. And so my advice to my younger self is to go for it. Those things that you are fearful of, those things that make you afraid, my advice to myself would have been just do them anyways and see what happens. And it lucked out. I think that I had that approach for skeleton, but I think about maybe other opportunities where maybe fear disrupted what could be possible.
Right.
And so my advice to my younger self would be to take that approach that I took in skeleton for everything that I could, and acknowledge that, yes, some things are going to make me afraid, but be willing to do it anyways and see what happens. Be willing to disrupt the norm. Don't just tick the boxes and just go in one straight path. Be willing to color outside of the lines.
I
And
love
that's
that.
what skeleton was for me. I'm way out of the lines.
No, and I'd like to say thank you for coloring outside the lines, for being an amazing ambassador to our continent, to Nigeria, to young girls, to everybody who's kind of trying to do something that's outside the mold. You're a tremendous inspiration to all of us. Thank you to all the participants who've tuned in from across the globe, and for your very thoughtful questions for this event. We're tremendously honored to have had you here with us. There'll be subsequent events, fireside conversations, but Simi, thank you once again for the inaugural fireside, and we look forward to connecting with you later.
Thank you so much. Have a good night, good day, wherever you are. Thank you.
Good night, good day, bye-bye. And that's the end of our event. Thank you.